Hi folks, and welcome to today's webinar. This is Amy with the Colorado Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I'm going to turn it over in just a moment, but I wanted to let you all know that as we go through the webinar, you might have some questions that come up. Please feel free to go ahead and type them into the question box on your dashboard, and we'll be sure to either answer them as we go along or save them for the Q&A portion at the end of the session. If you have any technical difficulties, also go ahead and put that into the chat box, and we'll see if we can troubleshoot from there.
Hi everyone, this is Phoebe. Thank you for jumping on today. So my name is Phoebe Gray. I'm the Housing Program Manager at the Colorado Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I'm here with...
Hi everyone, this is Ashley Riley-Lopes. I'm a Grants Administrator with the Division of Criminal Justice Office for Victims Programs. I apologize for my beautiful voice today, but we're very excited to have all of you here. This webinar will be recorded and will be posted probably later this afternoon on CCADV's website. We'll have a link for you to where you can access that, along with frequently asked questions. We're going to be compiling the questions you asked today and creating an FAQ to also post online later this afternoon.
And we're just so happy to have you here to talk about the Housing for Crime Victims Special Project. And we, as Ashley said, we hope that you'll continue to ask questions throughout the webinar and after as well. So just to get started here, we're going to just kind of go through an agenda for what we're hoping to get out of this webinar today. We're going to introduce the housing project and then go through some of the long-term housing models that we're looking at. And then we're also going to kind of break down the funding opportunity and what we're looking at with the housing project. So we're going to give you some resources and hopefully leave some good time at the end for question and discussion.
Really quick, if people could just tell us, can you hear us well? Are we speaking loud enough? And I don't know if somebody just wants to tell us in the chat box, or maybe raise your hands if you can hear us well, and then tell us if you can't in the chat, just so that we can adjust our volume level.
Okay, lots of folks are raising their hands, and everyone says sounds good, sounds great to me. So.
Wonderful. Okay, so we'll go ahead and proceed. Thank you all. So we just want to start off giving everyone a little bit of an introduction into the Housing for Crime Victims Special Project. So many of you remember in 2015, the Office for Victims Programs conducted a statewide needs assessment, really looking at what were the unmet needs of crime victims across the state. And as a result of that needs assessment, several unmet needs rose to the surface as being unmet across the state in every region, and those were civil legal services for crime victims, emergency funds for crime victims, and housing for crime victims. And so the Office for Victims Programs decided that we wanted to use some of the large influx of the Victims of Crime Act dollars that came into the state to address these issues statewide, and that's what brought us here today to this wonderful Housing for Crime Victims Special Project. And so DCJ's Office for Victims Programs is working collaboratively with CCADV, as well as a steering committee of subject matter experts and stakeholders, to address this need by supporting a set of demonstration sites across the state in the implementation of new methods of housing for crime victims. I do want to take a moment to explain to everyone a little bit about the steering committee. I know as we were leading up to kick the special project, many of you expressed interest in being on that steering committee, which we greatly appreciated. And we decided as an office, and along with our partner CCADV, that we would have the steering committee comprised of statewide stakeholders and subject matter experts rather than individual programs, because we didn't know if being a member of the steering committee could somehow disallow a program to actually apply for funds. And so we wanted to make sure that this funding opportunity was available to all of you. And so we did comprise our steering committee with some statewide partners, not only the coalition, but we also have other funders, other government agencies, experts in homeless initiatives, a representative from the Attorney General's office, some survivors, the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and other members. And so we hope that the needs of crime victims and programs are well heard by that steering committee with our diverse representation. So we just wanted to let you guys know that.
So now we're going to move into some evidence-based long-term housing approaches that we're really hoping that this project can support, and to kind of give you all an idea of the things that we're looking at. So the first one is Domestic Violence Housing First, which is out of Washington State. And this approach really focuses on getting survivors of domestic violence into stable housing as quickly as possible, and then providing the supports that they might need to remain stably housed and to rebuild their lives as they move forward. So really the philosophy of Housing First in general, as well as this approach, is low barrier with a focus on housing first versus housing ready. So I'll explain that a little bit more. So when we're talking about low barrier, really the aim of that is that we're providing access to services for folks with as few barriers and roles as possible. That includes how we screen folks into our programs and the services that they might get while they're in our program. And so, for example, if you have a low barrier Housing First shelter, for instance, or housing in general, clients or survivors would not be required to be abstinent from alcohol or be sober before they get into housing. So first it would be to get them into housing and then provide the supports that they might need to, for whatever they might need, whether it's substance use or other things, getting an income. Really the focus is on housing first. So that's what we mean by low barrier and prioritizing housing. And so Washington State Coalition received money from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2009, and they started some project sites then and have continued with other cohorts in 2011. And they've seen really great results from this project, and I'll give you some of that next, as well as some resources so you can get more information. But really the basic components of Domestic Violence Housing First include survivor-driven mobile advocacy. And really what we mean by that is, what do you need, right, versus instead of what we offer. So really listening to and responding to what survivors' needs and goals are, and focusing on that and being flexible in how we provide advocacy and services. And second part of mobile advocacy is meeting folks where it's safe and convenient for them. So meeting them in the community, going with them to their housing appointments, to other appointments that they might need, to really be alongside them as you do advocacy long-term, short-term. It's really, how do you do that in the way that's most convenient for the survivor in the community? And really most importantly, part of that survivor-driven piece is that survivors are the ones leading the process and choosing their goals. That is set by them, and that we respond to those in the best way that we can. So that's a really big approach, and other approaches that we're going to talk about today. The other piece of Domestic Violence Housing First is flexible financial assistance. And with this, basically what we're saying is funds are free to be used in whatever way that will best help the survivor retain housing. So it could be things like rent or utilities, but it also could be things like employment certification or childcare or transportation. And there's a lot of ways that these sites in Washington were able to use flexible financial funds in ways that maybe don't seem intuitive for housing stability, but sometimes they were able to maybe fix a survivor's car, right? And so that they could get to and from work, which would enable them to be able to pay their rent and to keep housing. So sometimes it's really being creative and kind of tying that flexible fund back into the survivor-driven piece. What are they saying that they need, and can this fit that need in order for them to maintain housing? So the other basic component of this approach is housing stability. So we kind of already talked about advocates going alongside survivors, and really a part of this housing stability piece is advocates, accompanying survivors to housing appointments, acting as a liaison between landlords and survivors, and maybe even negotiating leases and terms. This could look like a lot of different things, but again, it's that focus on housing stability as really the first step in this process. Lastly, the last component is community engagement. So advocates reaching out to landlords and building relationships, and getting landlords to work with the agency and letting them know, hey, we have funds that can support survivors, and we'll work with them if they want to continue to receive the advocacy and really building that network of landlords. It could be, engaging with law enforcement, which is things that a lot of you already do, right? You already collaborate with a lot of folks in your community. So it's just continuing that and expanding it, and working maybe with housing and homelessness partners in your community, like the public housing authorities or the homeless shelters or programs, to try to strengthen those ties and referrals. And really, encouraging the community to support survivors in the best way that they can. One of the sites in Washington really built a strong relationship with some of their mechanics and others in the community to provide services to survivors, that were cheaper for the agency and were able to support the survivor. So those are just some of the approaches. There's a lot of different examples, but those are the basic components when we're talking about this.
We had a question come in about the Domestic Violence Housing First program, and one participant wanted to know if we know what the actual average wait time for DV folks from housing instability episode to individual housing for this particular program.
Yes, there is that information around sort of how long it took, and it really depended on area. So sometimes it took, and I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, I apologize, but that is on the website that I'm going to give you. I think it usually took anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks. So sometimes, right, it was around then how do we work with survivors maybe in shelter or get them with family and friends until we can get them into their own place. And obviously in some areas where housing was less, there was less of it, it took longer. So that community mobile advocacy piece was important to then strategize around safety until the permanency, or at least the longer term housing could be an option. But I will give you the website, and I'd be happy to find out the exact numbers and send that out when we send the recording. Yeah, and then with the FAQs. So thank you for that question. So these are just some of the results. There are a lot. They've done a really good job in gathering data on this project and this approach, and they're actually getting ready to do a longer longitudinal study with some of the sites to kind of see the long-term impact of this approach. But some of these stats are from the more recent reports that came out. So about 96% of survivors retained their housing 18 months after entering the Domestic Violence Housing First program. So very high retention rate and success rate. 84% of survivors strongly agreed that the program increased their safety and the safety of their children. Another really good data. And with final follow-up, 76% were receiving minimal services from the program at a low cost to the agency. So that's also, it can be very cost effective. We're going to some of the other approaches will go into that more as well. And I think one of the cool things that are coming out of this approach in their reports is that even whether it was a rural area or urban or mid-sized city that was using this approach in Washington, about half of survivors only needed one-time limited funding in order to be successful. There were some that had the longer-term higher need, but a lot of them really only needed one-time assistance and were able to have some success with that. So that's exciting as well. And at the bottom, you can see a link, and I'm going to give you a resource list at the end as well so that you can go back and check out some more data on this approach. All right, so that's Housing First. One of the other approaches that we're looking at is through Volunteers of America Oregon, their Home Free program, which I'm sure some of you have heard about. So really this kind of going back to late 90s, in 1998, Volunteers of America actually expanded their shelter to do community outreach after a study came out that said only 15% of families surviving domestic violence accessed a hotline or a shelter. So they felt like they could be reaching more folks if they had a community approach in that area. So they started adding more services in 1998 and really taking on a housing first approach back then. So they've been doing this for a long time. And really how things look for them now is that they have two components for their housing program. They have emergency housing, which is scattered site with the mobile advocacy that we talked about, and then really just the short-term voucher hotel program. And a lot of those folks then go into the long-term housing part of their program, which is helping folks to secure long-term housing and to stay there. So, similar to the other Housing First approach we talked about, and they have flexible funding. So they have some funds that are earmarked for rental subsidy for folks, but they also have a flexible financial piece that can be used for a lot of the other things like we already talked about. And then they do the community-based mobile advocacy. So they're really out in the community with survivors, meeting with them, whether it's in the hotel, whether it's in the community, at their apartment, wherever it's most safe for the survivor. And their financial subsidy is commonly provided about 6 months to 1 year. And how that looks in terms of what percentage of rent that covers may vary, but the advocacy continues up to 2 years after that point. So some of their data, and again, there's a lot of this out there that you can find, and I've provided some links here, but 97% of households that were enrolled in their Housing First obtained safe housing, and 86% of these remained stably housed after 1 year of exiting services. And they did find, as I mentioned, that they were able to serve a higher proportion of Latino, African American, and Native American households than they had served in their shelter and transitional housing programs in the past by really implementing all aspects of this approach. And in one evaluation of their program, nearly 50% of participants had a history of mental health. Nearly 1/3 had an alcohol or drug history, and the majority were involved with child welfare. So that's just to say, these approaches can work really well with folks that sometimes are seen as difficult to serve. That often, if you're able to get folks into housing, some of these other things are able to be dealt with or treated once they're housed. It's really hard to sort of deal with some of these things if you don't have a place to stay. So that's really exciting. And really, these findings indicate that housing instability may be a stronger predictor of negative outcomes than the level of danger. And obviously, housing instability can increase danger as well. So there's that resource, and again, there will be a resource list at the end as well. So another approach that we're talking about here, and this kind of obviously goes very well with the other two, is flexible funding with brief advocacy. So we've been talking a lot about flexible funding. So what's the big deal, right? So the access to immediate funds for a variety of needs of victims can sometimes prevent them from ever becoming homeless, right? Being able to retain their housing. And for some, when it's paired with housing advocacy, at a variety of levels of support, that can also lead to a lot of success for victims. That's why that can be really important. And as we all know, grants they're great, but there's parts that can feel restrictive. And so having a pot of funds that can be used in a variety of ways that survivors are saying that they need can really promote a lot of really good outcomes and sometimes get them faster assistance. And there have been studies to show that direct funds to those in need have immediate and long-term positive impacts. So we know that it can work, and we know that flexible funding can also give victims access to resources that they need to stabilize. So that's exciting. And one example is the District Alliance for Safe Housing, which goes by DASH, which is in Washington, D.C., and they have a flexible funding arm, which is called the Survivor Resilience Fund, but they also have a lot of different housing. They have some scattered site housing, and they do also have a really large landlord network that they work with folks to provide subsidy and be able to keep folks housed. So they're doing a lot of these approaches as well, but they actually have a really kind of good way of indicating how do we know when to give folks funding, right? Because that may be a question. How do we kind of decide what's the process? And so this is some of the questions that they ask before giving flexible funding. And when we say this, right, so the first one is, can any other organization provide this resource? When asking these questions, advocates aren't necessarily just giving the victim a list of numbers to call, but really going alongside with them to help them make these calls, help them figure out if there's other resources that they can tap into. And then obviously kind of going back to that community engagement piece is if we have the relationships and we know who to call, right, then we can call with them and kind of see if there's other ways, other organizations that can provide that need, and then maybe we can use the funding for something else with them. So that's one question that they ask. And then just thinking about, will this help this person retain housing over time, not just today? Is it something that may help them long term? And that could be, something to talk through and maybe subjective. The process is victim-centered, as we've talked about this whole time, right? So we want it to be accessible for folks, we want it to be respectful, and we want to listen to what they're telling us that they need. And sometimes that may not seem intuitive to us, but often, as we know, survivors know what they need in order to be safe and to be successful. So really listening to them. And as I mentioned, one of the exciting things about this having flexible funding is that it can be fast, that we don't necessarily have to go through a ton of processes. We can quickly get folks the money that they may need. And maybe it's an urgent situation or not, but really I think that goes back to that respect piece of the victim-centered. And then we're also helping them with housing assistance search, right? And so, like I said, with DASH in DC, they have a really large landlord network that they've been able to build, and advocates are also having those relationships so that they know who to call. They can go with survivors to look at housing and to provide that ongoing support. And sometimes they do a home visiting as well with their advocates. And the victim determines what services they want, and so they're not required to get any other services just to access the flexible funding. If that's all that they need, they don't have to have any sort of ongoing advocacy per se. So again, there's that website. Okay, and then the last approach that we're looking at, I'm sure a lot of you know, it's been around for a long time, is the Community Action Project, which was developed by Chris Sullivan, I think in the 80s. So it's been around, and it's really one of the earliest evidence for the effectiveness of community-based mobile advocacy, which you're hearing me say a lot, but we know that it can work. And so this approach involves providing home-based and community-based advocacy services for survivors of domestic violence. And so the advocates are trained, they receive intense supervision to work with survivors and their children so that they can help connect them with community resources and the social support that they need. And so this intervention occurs in survivors' homes, in the community, and is generally short-term, about 10 weeks, but very intensive, so 6 hours a week. And this can vary. Some communities have increased that intensive amount of time, but that's sort of the general approach. So folks who are wanting to do this approach are trained through Community Action Project trained professionals in order to do this. So it's something that you're connected to through them. So the trained advocates are really helping survivors work on the goals that the survivors have determined are important to them. And so this has been really effective for folks who are either still in their relationship or who are leaving an abusive relationship. And even though this can vary in how it looks, there's some really important key components of this approach. And one is that the survivor, not the advocate, should guide the direction and activities of the intervention. So kind of going back to really listening to what survivors are saying that they need and responding to those goals. Also, this program is designed to create lasting positive change for survivors and to provide women with the knowledge and tools they need to successfully advocate for themselves. So really connecting them with the social supports in the community, so not just giving them resources and maybe doing things for them, but doing it with them so that they know and are connected in the community to be able to continue to access the things that they need moving forward. And I think these are some things on why this approach can fit really well with housing. Like we've already talked about, it has a lot of the components we've already discussed. And often, as we know, housing is an identified need of many of the folks that we work with. And so this can really fit well with how we then go alongside the people that we're working with to help them find housing and retain it, to access services. And this can be kind of easily compiled with things like flexible funding, as we talked about. And this, the evidence behind this approach in mobile advocacy is that it can lead to higher social support, a decreased risk of re-abuse, and access to needed services, and a higher quality of life. And there's a lot of information on this approach and a lot of good data, and so I would encourage you to check out that website, and I'll have it listed again as well.
Yeah. So, Stevie, going back to the Oregon Free program, one participant asked, do you have any info on employment acquisition after housing?
That's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, but I can definitely find that out. And I know that I think some of these approaches, at least in the domestic violence housing first, I know has some of that data, but I can definitely find out in relation to the Home Free program. Yeah, and we're gonna put together an FAQ from some of the questions that you have today, if there's things that we don't know, so that we can post that on our website. And I'll put that information, how to access the FAQ, in the follow-up email that we send out. Thank you, that's a really good question. Okay, so just to summarize, there are many different approaches to housing. These are just a few examples. We're not saying this is the end-all, be-all, but these are some of the examples out there that we now have good evidence behind them that have been shown to work. There's no one-size-fits-all. And I think what's really neat about these approaches is that how they are implemented in your community with the folks you work with can look very different, and it can be very tailored to the community that you're in. There's not, the things I've mentioned are things that can really be easily adapted in your community, in your program, depending on, what that looks like, what the makeup of your community is, and what the makeup of the folks that you serve is. So to me, that's exciting. And obviously, just kind of reiterating, many of these approaches include flexible funding, housing assistance and advocacy, and victim-driven mobile advocacy. That's really throughout most of these approaches. And some of these may have more systems advocacy than others, but all of these approaches are based on listening and responding to what victims are saying that they need. That's really in the core of all of these approaches. And I do just want to say, we recognize that the approaches I've mentioned are really mainly have been tested with domestic violence survivors. So part of this project with the Housing for Crime Victims special project will be figuring out, how these approaches work with other types of crime victims. We know that these have been shown to work with domestic violence, and we feel that they'll work well with other types of crime victims, but that's going to be part of what we're going to be looking at in this project. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Ashley.
Thank you, Stevie. Wonderful. So thanks for mentioning that, Stevie, because we do know that many of these aforementioned approaches are DV specific, but it's an exciting project for us because we want to see how parts of these aforementioned practices can be used to serve other types of crime victims in addition to domestic violence. So just to go over a little bit about the funding opportunity. So we're really excited about the approach to this project was not only to form a steering committee and really look at some new innovative practices, but then to push out some of the Victims of Crime Act VOCA funds throughout the state to programs, give them the opportunity to then try to implement some of these aspects in their existing programming, or to create a new program that would implement some of these practices. So that being said, projects can submit for funding to either add a piece of one of the practices to existing programming. So for example, if most of your advocacy services are shelter-based and victims are coming to see your advocate at the shelter, maybe you want to incorporate some mobile advocacy where you are having your advocates go out and meet with crime victims in other locations. That would be one aspect you could implement. And then also funding can be requested to start programming modeled after the aforementioned approaches. So you want to try one of these models and you need a little bit more substantial support to do that. That's also appropriate for this funding opportunity. So just to remind you, while we're going to talk a little bit more now about what we're looking for and what's eligible, only VOCA eligible expenses and activities can be funded through this funding opportunity, and all funded organizations must comply with all requirements associated with receiving VOCA funds. So many of you on the webinar today are currently grantees through the Office for Victims programs, the Crime Victim Services grant funds, either a VAWA, VOCA, SASP, or State Vail, and so you may be fairly familiar with reporting requirements and eligibility requirements and paperwork. So all of that will still apply in this funding opportunity because programs will be creating grant agreements with the state directly. So none of that, unfortunately, for all of us will go away. It'll still be there. And so that means that the activities that and types of crime victims that can be supported through this funding project must be VOCA eligible, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Lastly, we just want to let you all know that programs must submit a letter of intent to us by November 7th to be eligible. So that is a requirement, and so we're going to talk about where to send that. All correspondence, questions, the letter of intent, et cetera, are all going to go to Stevie. We have her email later in the PowerPoint just to consolidate it and not confuse everybody, and then we'll be looking at those as a steering committee, and as an Office for Victims Programs, we'll be looking at those for next steps. So those are all due November 7th. We're going to, like I said, we're going to talk about it more in a couple slides ahead, but that is a requirement to be eligible for the funding. So please make sure that you get those in by November 7th, and they're going to be sent via email. So I want to talk a little bit about, in more detail, about what types of activities would be eligible under this funding opportunity. And so these are things that you'd want to include, you know, a somewhat of an outline in your letter of intent, but then later in your application when we get to that step. So currently, as many of you know, the VOCA rule was updated and passed in August of this year, and so this is kind of the eligibility requirements our office is currently working under. And so these are things that will be eligible. I can't tell you today to what extent as far as, you know, some of the more specific details of what will be eligible, but in general, these are the items that will be eligible. So emergency shelter support, rental assistance. And when I say I can't tell you the specifics, I can't tell you today how many months of rental assistance will be eligible, or if we will be able to pay past due rent. I know currently our office is really digging deep into the VOCA rule to try and figure out what, as a state, will be kind of our interpretation of the rule. So I hope to have more details for you as we approach funding opportunity announcement. But as of today, just know that rental assistance will be eligible, but in what capacity and for how many months, et cetera. Those types of details I unfortunately don't have today. Hotel stay will be eligible, utilities assistance, short-term nursing home shelters for elder abuse victims, and so there's caveats, you know, when no other safe short-term residence is available. Bus tickets and transportation, moving expenses, relocation assistance, transitional housing, these expenses for dependents. And then I wanted to let you know that these are the types of personnel support that we could also support, which would be support for a victim advocate to serve as a housing advocate, or to serve as a housing coordinator. So coordination of direct service activity as an eligible activity under VOCA now. So if somebody in your agency was going to be building those relationships throughout your community with landlords or the homeless shelters or other service providers or, you know, faith leaders or community leaders, those types of coordination activities would be eligible. And then providing those direct advocacy services with a housing component would also be eligible. Minimal support of supervisors of the direct service providers. So just want to let you know that we can pay for a portion of another staff member who oversees that direct service personnel. So that's something that you can think about including in your application. And then the last one is program evaluation. So some sort of component within your project that seeks to evaluate the effectiveness of the approach. So like Stevie and I both have said, we know that a lot of these approaches are very evidence-based, but primarily, some of them are primarily looking at the success with domestic violence survivors. And so we want to include a evaluation component so that we can see if these approaches are successful with other types of crime victims. And, you know, that being said, the other really exciting part of this special project is we don't know if they're going to be successful. Not only do we not know if they're going to be 100 bazillion % successful with other types of crime victims, but for our state, we don't know how they're going to be successful. So I think it's really exciting to have the opportunity to try some of these approaches, to evaluate them, and then to come out and say, okay, these aspects really worked for our community and for our state and for our those we serve, and we're excited to share that data and replicate it and to make it best practice So that's really an exciting piece. So there is some personnel support that we can do and some overhead costs. Okay, so these are a couple things I just wanted to point out that are important to remember. So one thing that, if you were listening, Stevie said many, many, many times, was that flexible funding is really a key component of implementing these approaches. And so obviously, you know, flexible funding does not go hand in hand with federal funding. So we just want to remind you all that, you know, if you can apply for these funds for VOCA eligible activities that support your project, we're hoping that you can then free up some of your other more flexible funding sources, be it private donors, be it foundation funding, be it other grant sources, to then use to create the flexible funding component. Since VOCA can pay for some financial assistance for victims, like we talked about in a couple slides ago, you know, rental assistance, hotel stays, utilities, relocation, some transportation, etc. You know, there are things that this funding can do, but that being said, there's many limitations. You know, we can't fix victims' cars, we can't buy them tires, we can pay for child care in explicit circumstances, but there's just limitations on federal funding. And so we want to just be clear that we know this funding opportunity is not the be-all, end-all for your success in this program, and that there is an expectation that you will have some sort of flexible funding source to meet some of the other components as needed for the victims you're serving. So this funding opportunity is not meant to provide support for existing forms of transitional or emergency shelter, unless the project is attempting to implement aspects of the aforementioned housing model. So if you have a more traditional transitional or emergency shelter program and you want to incorporate some of the aspects that we talked about, so mobile advocacy, low barrier structure, then that would be appropriate. But we're not looking to just fund existing transitional housing programs or emergency shelters. So that being said, I just want to remind everyone that by no means are we stating that current or traditional forms of transitional housing or emergency shelter are not useful or important for crime victims, nor do we want to replace these methods. So this is just the opportunity for programs to try new, promising approaches to helping crime victims obtain long-term housing stability. So this is just an opportunity to try some new things and see how they work. Hopefully work very well, and hopefully they can be a great additional service we can provide to crime victims throughout our state. But by no means are we saying that there's not a place for transitional housing or emergency shelter. They're still very important services for survivors. I also just want to again say we already kind of beat the dead horse about that a lot of the ones Stevie talked about were DV specific, but I want to remind everybody, I know a lot of you on the call may not serve domestic violence victims or primarily serve domestic violence victims, and that's perfectly fine. You also don't have to be a member of the Colorado Coalition Against Domestic Violence or any coalition to apply for these funds. You really have to meet the VOCA eligibility requirements, which include being a direct service provider to crime victims, serving the eligible type of VOCA crime victim, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Okay, so like my slide before on eligible expenses, this is a tentative timeline. We're really hoping we can make it work, but you know, we just want to be upfront with you guys about the fact that you know we are creating the wheel here, and this is a new funding opportunity, which is exciting. But we also don't know how many letters we're going to get, how long it's going to take for our steering committee and the Office for Victims Programs to review those and applications, et cetera. So this is where we're hoping to be this year with our timeline for this funding opportunity and this project. So obviously today we can check that one off the list. We are having our webinar in September. Again, the letter of intent, which we're going to outline after this, is going to be due November 7th. We're hoping to complete the RFP and announce the funding opportunity between December and January. We understand that it's not a great time of year for anyone. We understand that DVP, Domestic Violence Program, is also announcing their funding opportunity in January, and that this could create you know, a lot of stress on programs. We apologize for that, but we also really want to get this opportunity announcement out to you as soon as possible so that you can apply and then we can get the money out to programs. So we do not want to keep the money in the state. We want to get it out to you and to the victims you serve. Based on this tentative timeline, the RFP, your application would be due in February. We would take the month of March to review and score the applications, and then hopefully select our sites by the end of the month. I don't have specifics on how many sites we're going to have because we are not sure. I also don't have specifics on the amount of money that we have available because it's going to depend on how well justified and appropriate the applications are. So there is no minimum or maximum on what you can request. The caveat is eligibility and justification. So it has to be well justified and it has to be eligible. April, we would say hopefully our project sites would accept and complete our grant agreements. And then, in a perfect world, May 1st, funding would begin, and it would be a 20-month grant cycle. So I can explain a little bit our thinking behind this long grant cycle. So one is we understand that these approaches take a long time to implement. Not only does it require a shift within your organization, but potentially a shift within your community. And so we understand that change is difficult and takes time. We also want to give you all enough funding stability, per se, to really not have to worry about another application, et cetera, anytime super soon so that you can focus on doing the work. So our goal would be to start May 1, have you begin your projects through the end of 18 with the last couple months, 6 months of 2018, really preparing to hopefully apply for Crime Victim Services funds through the Office for Victims Programs to begin in 2019. So we want to kind of wrap up this project with you hopefully applying successfully to continue your project as eligible and as funding allows through the regular Crime Victim Services funding opportunity. So we're hoping, to give you some TA and support so that you can be successful in identifying which aspects of the project work for your community and your organization so that you can then make them a regular part of your programming. Okay, so the letter of intent. So we're asking that everyone interested in applying for grant funds, and by no means is this a guarantee on your behalf that you actually will apply, but if you are at all interested and think it's a possibility, you should complete a letter of intent no later than November 7th, 2016. So we're going to have a sample LOI we're going to talk about in a second. It'll also be posted on CCADV's website for you to see. Don't recreate the wheel. Feel free to use it as is and obviously input your community and program specific data. And we would like that LOI sent by the deadline to Stevie, and there's her email, sgray@ccadv.org. So let's take a look at that letter of intent.
Well, that's a little bit bigger here.
Well, that one is bad, I think. Yeah, there you go.
There we go.
Yay!
Can everyone see this, or is it not showing?
I wonder if we can see it more. That looks good. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Okay, wonderful. So we'll go through this really briefly. Obviously, we'd like it on your agency letterhead. It's going to be addressed to me. Obviously, that's probably confusing because it is emailed to Stevie, but this is what it is. And so we'd like you to let us know an approximation of how much you plan to request. We understand, again, this may change, but we'd like to have an approximation of how much funding you would be seeking. And remember, the estimated time period would be May 1st, so a 20-month grant period. So accordingly, ask accordingly. That amount should reflect the total amount for that 20-month grant period. And then we ask that you briefly describe your project and organization, how it's aligned with the Housing for Crime Victims Special Project, and answer the following questions. So we want you to talk about what your agency does not need to be extensive, but it's really just to determine if you provide direct victim services, what types of crime victims you serve, and if you would be an eligible entity, especially if our office is unfamiliar with you. And then we're asking if you will talk a little bit about what direct services you currently provide, so that we can determine if they're a VOCA eligible crime. So below, and this is going to be teeny, teeny, tiny on this screen, but we do list what types of victims are eligible to be supported by the VOCA funds. And I'm not going to read those out to you. It's a pretty extensive list. And so, you would need to be serving a type of victim that is listed there. Again, though, if you have any concerns or questions about whether or not you would be an eligible entity or the types of crime victims you serve are eligible, you can always contact Stevie, and if she doesn't know the answer, she can share it with me and I'll provide the answer, and we'll put it in those frequently asked questions. Again, we're asking if your agency can provide a cash match of up to 25% of the requested amount of funding if required. So we ask that you let us know if this is going to be an issue for your agency up front, because providing match is a requirement of receiving VOCA funds, and so that will be something that you will have to do. I think it also helps us realize whether or not you are prepared to have that flexible funding piece, so that we know that, hey, I have these general operating dollars or I have these private foundation funds that I can use as match to say, these are my flexible funding component. So we just want to be transparent with you up front that this is a requirement and you'll have to meet it. Depending on whether or not your agency has a history of providing crime victim services or the new to the state CVS funding, you may be required to provide 25% match. If you're a long-term regular grantee, the match may be a little bit lower. And then lastly, how will your agency structure a housing program in a victim-driven, low-barrier way? So we included this because we're interested to hear how you plan to implement some of these aspects of the aforementioned approaches, because we understand that it's a shift. It's a shift for everyone to start talking about, housing is the first priority, and that we really have to meet victims exactly where they are to fulfill their needs. And I understand that as programs we are doing this and trying to do this, but it may be a little bit more of a shift in lessening some of the rules we have for our facilities, the way we engage with victims. And so we're interested to hear if you're already doing this. Wonderful. Give us some ideas and suggestions, or show us examples so that we can share those with other programs. Or if you want to do this and how and what aspects you want to do it, we're really excited to hear that. So please share that with us in this letter of intent.
Actually, do crime victims need to have filed a police report to be eligible for these funds?
No, that's a great question, and I hope I'm going to address that. Maybe I'm not. That's really great that you brought that up. So we want to remind everybody that no, being a victim of a crime does not require you to engage with the criminal justice system. So reporting is not a requirement. There's no type of affidavit that's required to show you're a victim of one of the eligible crimes. So a lot of our victims, as we know, won't ever engage with criminal justice or systems, and so that's definitely not a requirement. Okay, so there's the LOI. Like I said, it's going to be on the website. Don't recreate the wheel. And then please, please, please send it to Stevie by November 7th. Even if you're not 100% sure you want to follow through and apply, we still highly encourage you to send us an LOI, because if you don't, unfortunately, we're going to not allow you to apply. So it's better safe than sorry. So there's that. And now I'm going to turn it back to Stevie to talk about resources.
And I will say the LOI is already on the website under that link here, the ccadv.org/housing. It's just towards the bottom. And that's where we're going to put anything related to the housing project as well, like the slides or reporting. So just so that you know. Okay, so here's a list of some resources. There could be many more, but the program sites I mentioned, or that we went through, those are their websites at the beginning. There's also some really good national resources that talk a lot about these different models. Housing First and some of these other approaches have been tried in the housing and homelessness world, and there's a lot of evidence and information about that there through the National Alliance to End Homelessness, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and the other two that are listed below, as well as some other organizations, are actually collaborating to do a housing partnership to really provide more TA around housing for survivors. And so there's a lot of really good resources on those websites as well. And these should also be listed on the CCADV website too, so in case you need those. And then there's my information again as well. Probably the best way to reach me is by email right now, but if you call and leave me a voicemail, I will call you back as soon as possible. So these are just some resources to help you as you think about, whether it's the LOI or thinking about how these might apply in your community. There's a lot of really good information out there, and I'm happy to direct you to certain ones if you, let me know if you have questions, because I know this is kind of a lot. So if there's something specific you want or a specific resource, just feel free to reach out and let me know. And again, the slides and the recording will be sent out and posted, so you can get all of these then as well. All right, so we have some time for some discussion and questions. So for folks that have questions, if you'll just type your questions in the chat box or the question box, we'll try to answer some of them.
So we do have one question coming in. Can the funding be used toward helping undocumented individuals?
This is Ashley. Yes. There's no eligibility requirements associated with status.
Great. Okay, we've got a couple more coming in. So when might there be more information available about what specifically can be funded? So in terms of things like how transitional housing might be defined, how many months of rent assistance are possible, et cetera.
So this is Ashley again. We're hoping to have those definitions sooner than later. I don't think we're going to be able to provide those necessarily prior to the LOI submission date, but we may. That would be wonderful if we could. I know our office is working really, diligently to get those kind of put together with, unfortunately minimal guidance from our federal office. It's really kind of been pushed back on the states to now determine what the rule means for our state, and which is, great, but it's also time consuming and takes time, and we want to do a good job of it. So best case scenario would be before the LOI. Worst case scenario would be for sure it'll be included in the announcement of funds so that your application can follow those requirements. So I would say, that's why I say I understand the LOI and the amount you're requesting, what you hope to do, may not have as much direction as it would with those more detailed requirements. But so if none of that will exclude you from being able, so if you write an LOI saying we want to pay, a month or a year's rent for everyone who we serve, that ends up not being an eligible expense, we can only pay, say, 6 months. That will not preclude you from applying for funds. You would just have to tailor your request to the 6 months, and you could still provide the additional 6 months. It just couldn't come directly from VOCA. I know that was kind of a long-winded. So if that didn't answer your question, please say no and ask it again, or put something again.
So how much funding is available through the program?
So that's a great question, and again, one I don't have an answer to. So luckily, happily, we have a lot of funding available. I don't have a specific dollar amount, but again, the caveat is well justified. So expenses that are eligible, so eligibility and justification are the two key criteria. So if it's an eligible expense, it's well justified, it makes sense why you're requesting it and your intended outcomes, then it should be fundable. So there's no cap necessarily. We'll get to that point after we receive all the applications, but I don't want to encourage programs to go in thinking, oh, well, if I ask over X amount, they're not going to fund me. I think you need to think about what your community needs and what your program needs for a 20-month grant period to really create some sustainable change and change the way you're serving crime victims, and go for it.
Do you know yet if it can be used for legal, such as family or civil or immigration fees?
I want to say no, it cannot be, and I don't know if my lovely coworker Debbie Cassian, who's our VOCA administrator, is on here. She was supposed to be spying on me, make sure I don't say anything bad, but I don't believe it will be, and so again, that would be something that your flexible funding sources would need to pay for.
Which of the models highlighted has shown to work better with systems-based advocacy programs, if we know that?
I think that's a good question. Most of these models, because of the flexibility, are really more rooted in community-based organizations. So I don't know, off the top of my head, if there's any that have been more sort of involved in the systems, but obviously, as I mentioned, there's the community engagement piece, which collaboration with systems can be really important in all of these approaches, if that's, working for what survivors need, which is often, right, a better community approach to serving victims. And so I really feel like all of them work well within that, but tend to be maybe more rooted in community-based programs, from what I understand.
So is this funding only for new projects, or will it cover existing costs related to housing?
So as aforementioned, if you're looking to implement parts of these project aspects into existing programming, that would be eligible. But if you're just wanting to support existing services that don't implement any of these aspects, new kind of promising practices aspects, that wouldn't be eligible. So it doesn't have to be a new project. It would just be, hey, we're wanting to enhance how we do this aspect of our programming because we've only been able to take it so far, and we want to move even farther towards, a housing first model or a mobile advocacy model, et cetera. So those types of enhancements would be eligible.
So do you expect to serve more people for less time or less people for more time as a realistic objective?
Expect more people for less time or less people for more. I don't think we know.
Yeah, I don't know that it's either, honestly. I think it could be both. I think there's the expectation that you're serving folks in the way they need to be served, and some may only need that less time, right? But some could need long-term advocacy for years, right? And so I don't know that there's an expectation either way.
And I just want to point out, too, something Stevie talked about, but that, is another really exciting aspect of some of these approaches, is that what they're finding is implementing some of the aspects of the approaches is really enabling programs to better meet the needs of some of their traditionally underserved populations or difficult to serve. I hate to say that, but how, traditionally deemed difficult to serve or difficult to work with populations. And so, we understand that some of these survivors or crime victims have very complex needs. So I don't think by any means we're saying that it may be quicker or, we're not looking for that type of solution. We're looking for better solutions or different solutions than we currently have because we're hoping to meet the need in a new, improved way.
So since this is a special project, how will you, the funders and project managers, provide a consistent overall evaluation for the efficacy of the work being done?
That's a great question. So as a state, the Office for Victims Programs is actually looking at doing statewide evaluation of not only all the special projects, but the influx of VOCA dollars into the state and how those have been pushed out to programs, what the impact has been for not only survivors of crimes, but also for programs, and if they've been able to increase their capacity, what they've now been able to do with the increased availability of these types of funds. So we are working on that at a state level. Another aspect of this, which will be included in the RFP for this special project, will be some consistent or across-the-board evaluation points that we're going to ask every demonstration site to evaluate. Obviously, they will be tailored to what type of crime victim you serve, but there will be some common measurements that we ask all of the program sites to measure over the 20-month period. And we're hoping, one, that these will allow us to see what aspects are successful for what types of crime victims and in what regions and communities, but also give programs and our state data to use when applying for other funding to say this works and this is what works for our community, and we have this data to back it up.
So will any funds be available after the 20-month demonstration grant period for full project implementation or expansion?
Yeah, so that is why we're really excited to, for those of you who are already, which I saw who asked that question, I know you are, a current Crime Victim Services grantee, we just finished, this year we announced our funding for our 2-year cycle. We're in the middle of completing grant agreements with all of our 198 new grantees for the next 2 years. So that funding will run through 2017 and 2018. So programs will be asked to apply again for crime victim services funds in 2018. And so that will be giving the programs, almost, let's say, 9 months or a little more of having run this special project or this demonstration site to then see what they may want to ask for when the announcement for crime victim services funds comes out in early 2018. And if they are awarded those funds, then they will have continuation funding of this project for 2019 and 20. So the goal is to really, get this in place, let programs start trying some of these approaches, have some sustainable funding for 20 months, but then also include in there that they would need to apply for continued funding of it in the regular process. So we can just roll it in. And nobody has to write an additional grant application. They can just include it in their regular crime victim services application that they'll apply for again in 2018.
So will you all be providing feedback or responses to the LOIs based on the guidelines? So for example, if an applicant says that they plan to do a certain thing in the LOI and it turns out that some of what they propose is not eligible, would you respond and tell them what is and what is not going to be eligible for the RFP?
Yes, that's a great question. Yes, that is our plan. So, once the state, the Office for Victims Programs has really decided that eligibility criteria, then we can provide more guidance to you all, but we won't know who to provide it to necessarily in what fashion if we don't have your LOI. So that's a great idea. So that'll be part of the step between receiving your LOI and the announcement of funding. And again, all of those requirements and eligibility requirements will be in the RFP. So if there's something in your project you're unsure about, it will be listed in the RFP or the instructions, and we'll also be doing another webinar so we can answer questions if it's unclear. But yeah, that is part of our plan.
Is there a limitation on how long ago the crime had to occur for a victim to be eligible for some of this funding?
So at this point, no. I cannot tell you that won't change because I don't know that if that is something that as a state office we decide we need to put some sort of limitation or requirement on, but at this point, no, there's not. I do want to say, though, that to be eligible for use of these funds, there has to be a link between crime victimization and the need for the fund. So, how you justify that and make that link is on you. But it's the same with our other crime victim services funding opportunity. Their need for assistance in whatever way you're providing it, be it flexible funding, housing, advocacy, needs to be tied to their crime victimization. So that's kind of the key caveat at this point. I don't think our office wants to go in the direction of, putting some sort of time limitation on when their victimization occurs, because as we all know and research shows, crime victimization affects a survivor, generations after it occurred. So we're not looking to do that. I can't promise you it won't happen, but I don't think it will. But it is still on the applicant to well justify the eligible expense. So that's really on you guys to make the justification.
Currently, that's all the questions that have come in so far, folks. There's still plenty of time if you have other questions that Stevie and Ashley can address today.
We'll just wait a little bit. And I just want to say thank you, Debbie. Debbie said she agrees with me. So thanks, Deb. Thanks for having my back.
And certainly, if you digest some of this information and other questions come up, please email Stevie at the address previously provided. That's sgray@ccadv.org. And we will make available, as she said before, the slides for this presentation and the recording of this presentation on the website at ccadv.org/housing, which is where you'll also find that template LOI. I think that you might have satisfied all the questions so far.
Wow. Okay. Well, as we've already mentioned, please reach out with any questions that you might have to me. There's my email, there's my phone number. You know, as things come up, as you're, you know, going through certain things, let me know if there's something that, you know, again, a resource I can point you to, a question I can answer, and if I don't know, I'll find out, or I'll bring it to Ashley or the larger committee. So that's what we're here for. We really want this to be something that folks are excited about and interested in, and, you know, I know it's a new thing, so it can be kind of maybe intimidating since we don't know everything, but ask. That's what we're here for, and just getting that LOI in is really important.
No, I just want to say thank you all so much for attending, and we're excited about this new opportunity to support the amazing work you're already doing and allowing you the support to try new practices and implement some new approaches. So we're very excited, and thank you.
Thank you all so much, and hopefully I'll be hearing from you.